Hi, and welcome to Experience Points by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. I'm your host, Dave Ang from Games-Based Learning by University XP. Find out more by going to universityxp.com. Today, we're diving into something that sits at the intersection of education, game design, and critical thinking: matrix games. If you've ever wished there was a way to teach complex topics, military strategy, geopolitics, organizational behavior, or crisis response, without expensive simulations or thick stacks of rulebooks, you're going to want to stick around and learn more about matrix games. That's because they are deceptively simple, surprisingly powerful, and arguably one of the most flexible tools in the applied learning toolkit. Now, let's get into it. So what exactly is a matrix game? At its core, a matrix game is a structured argumentation system used for learning through play. They were developed back in 1992 by Chris Engle, who wanted a teaching tool that was simpler and more flexible than the rules-heavy wargames and role-playing games of the era. The idea behind matrix games is straightforward. You have a scenario, usually one with a conflict or problem at its center. Then you have players who take on roles within that scenario. And you also have an umpire, which is a term borrowed from wargaming, who acts as a referee. In the classroom, that umpire is the instructor. Players make arguments about what their character, faction, or team does next, and those arguments drive the story and the game forward. That's it. No thick rulebook, no complicated mechanics, just structured conversation guided by someone who knows the subject matter. Now, argumentation is where matrix games really shine. So let's break down how it works. A player proposes an action they want to take. Then they give 2 or 3 reasons why that action should succeed. Other players can then challenge the action by offering counter-arguments or reasons why it might fail. The umpire weighs both sides and decides. If an argument has no opposition, it succeeds automatically. If the counter-argument is weak, the action has a high chance of working. So, what happens if there is strong opposition on both sides? That means that you've got a real contest. This 3-reason system forces players to think rigorously. They can't just say, I want to win the battle. They have to defend why, they have to anticipate objections, and they have to ground their reasoning in the scenario's context. And this is where learning happens. Players stop relying on intuition and start engaging in deliberate, analytical thinking. They have to draw on course materials, historical knowledge, and real-world principles to make their case. The umpire's job is to listen carefully, weigh the quality of the reasoning, and adjudicate fairly. Good arguments get rewarded while weak ones get exposed. But here's the thing, nothing in a matrix game is ever guaranteed. Even the best argument can fail. That's where dice come in. When arguments are evenly matched or when the umpire wants to inject some uncertainty, a 6-sided die roll decides the outcome. Some umpires rule that a natural 1 or 6 means automatic failure or success, regardless of how strong the argument was. This randomness might sound frustrating, but it actually serves an important purpose. It mirrors real life. History is full of brilliant plans undone by bad luck and reckless gambles that somehow paid off. Dice keep players humble, and they push everyone to make the strongest possible case because you never know when fate might intervene. A typical matrix game has 6 to 8 players plus the instructor serving as an umpire, though you can scale up or down depending on your group. Players can be divided into teams representing nations, organizations, military units, or even individual characters. The key is assigning clear roles, each with their own objectives, capabilities, and worldview. This matters because the game isn't really about who wins. It's about what players learn through inhabiting those roles. When a student has to argue from the perspective of a diplomat, a general, or an opposition leader, they start to understand the constraints and motivations that shape real-world decisions. That perspective taking is incredibly powerful for developing empathy and strategic awareness. Running a matrix game is simpler than you might think. You need a room, maybe a table, some dice, and prep material so your players understand the scenario going in. A session typically runs 2 to 3 hours and unfolds in rounds. You start by recapping the scenario, the setting, the conflict, and who's involved. Then you explain the basic rules. Honestly, the best way to teach the rules is just to play. Once players propose their first few actions and you adjudicate them, everyone catches on quickly. But the game itself isn't where most of the learning lands. The real magic happens in the debrief. After play ends, you step back and ask, what assumptions did players make? Which arguments held up under scrutiny? How did chance affect the outcomes? And what would you do differently next time? This is where students connect the game experience back to course objectives, real-world principles, and their own thinking. Don't skip the debrief. It's the most important part of the whole exercise. So why use matrix games? Their biggest strength is flexibility. If a topic can be debated, it can be a matrix game. Military history, business strategy, public policy, crisis management, the framework adapts to almost anything. They're also cheap. They don't need expensive software or proprietary materials. Just engage people in a room with a knowledgeable facilitator. But they're not perfect. The unlimited choice structure can overwhelm players who don't know the material. Without context, learners freeze up or make poor arguments because they don't have the knowledge to draw on. The fix is to provide solid prep materials and maybe offer a starting menu of possible actions for first-timers. Matrix games can also oversimplify complex situations if the umpire isn't careful. That's why subject matter expertise matters so much. The instructor isn't just a referee, they're also a guide who keeps the scenario grounded in reality. If you want to try designing your own Matrix game, start small. Pick a scenario with clear opposing factions and a real problem to solve. Define the roles. Brief your players ahead of time. And remember, the system serves the learning, not the other way around. Lastly, don't get hung up on rules. Focus on the conversation, the argumentation, and the critical thinking that emerges. The best advice I can give: play a matrix game before you run one. Then run a matrix game before you design one. Matrix games reward instructors who are patient, curious, and willing to let their students drive the narrative. If you're working on applied learning in your classroom, training program, or organization, give matrix games a serious look. They're a powerful way to develop critical thinkers who can argue, adapt, and reason through complexity. I hope you found this episode useful. If you'd like to learn more, then a great place to start is with my free course on gamification. You can sign up for it at universityxp.com/gamification. You can also get a full transcript of this episode, including links to references in the description or show notes. Thanks for joining me. Again, I'm your host, Dave Bang from Games-Based Learning by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. If you like this episode, please consider commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Subscribing is absolutely free and ensures that you'll get the next episode of Experience Points delivered directly to you. I'd also love it if you took some time to rate the show. I live to lift others with learning, so if you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with someone who could also benefit. Also, make sure to visit University XP online at universityxp.com. University XP is also on Twitter at university_XP and on Facebook and LinkedIn as University XP. Also, feel free to email me anytime. My email address is dave@universityxp.com. Game on.